At the height of the classical ancient world, the land of pharaohs was already ancient. The Great Pyramids of Giza had already towered over the Nile for thousands of years. Many of the greatest pharaohs had already begun to fade from Egyptian memory, and the scattered colossal monuments that prompted what Herodotus called a land filled with wonder stood as silent witnesses to an ancient kingdom that reached its cultural, military, and economic zenith long before the rest of the ancient world. And it seemed like with the invasion of Persia in 525 BC, Egypt was beginning to slip into obscurity. But Egypt had one last story to tell, and after nearly 1,000 years of gradual decline in the autumn of 332 BC, Egypt would begin to place itself yet again at the center of the ancient world for the next 3 centuries. And it would be the home and birthplace for some of the world's most influential historical figures. Anyone who loves ancient history is familiar with the Library of Alexandria, the intellectual and technological zenith of the ancient world, slowly deteriorating throughout the end of Hellenistic Egypt and finally partially burned to the ground during the siege of Alexandria. Nobody quite knows what books and documents the library housed, but the visitors and contributors to that library include some of the greatest minds and famous people of the ancient world. But there was so much more to Alexandria than just its library. At one point, Alexandria was larger and more grand than even Rome. Built almost entirely out of stone, granite, and marble, it was the inspiration for almost all classical cities that came after it. It housed not only the ancient world's greatest library, it was also home to the world's first lighthouse on the small island of Pharos off the coast of Alexandria. It contained multiple palaces, Greek amphitheaters, Roman baths, Egypt's second Serapeum, a stadium for chariot racing, Roman catacombs, a scientific and astronomical center, a university, and so much more. 2,000 years later, Alexandria is home to the relics of this ancient hub, complete with sunken megaliths, enormous statues, ruined temples, Roman baths, and apartment buildings. Even the lost tombs of Cleopatra and Alexander lie somewhere beneath the modern city. In my new series, Alexandria, I will be exploring every single aspect of the city they once called the light of the ancient world, which brought the cultures, great minds, and rulers of Egypt, Greece, and Rome into one city. So without any further ado, this is Alexandria. I want to take a moment to announce something that I'm really excited for, where I will be bringing you guys along with me for my very first trip to Egypt, where you'll get to experience the Great Pyramids, the Sphinx, the Step Pyramid, the Bent Pyramid, the Serapeum, Luxor Temple, Edfu, and so many other locations with me for the very first time. Furthermore, this trip is also going to tie into this brand new series covering the city of Alexandria, which isn't something that very many tours do. We will have an exclusive and very rare 2-day trip to Alexandria, and from there we will descend down the Nile on a luxury cruise through Giza and the Great Pyramids, the Sphinx, and the pyramids in the deserts of Dashur, all the way down to Aswan. Cleopatra's Egypt will be an expedition aimed to present the entire land of pharaohs through the lens of people collecting ancient knowledge in Alexandria's library. So expect to learn the history of the Library of Alexandria, why it was burned, what may have been lost, and what happened to the library after the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC. The tour dates are January 13th through the 26th of 2025. I'll have a link to claim your spot today down in the description and the comment sections below. In 332 BC, Egypt was under the rule of the Persian king Darius III. For much of the last 2 centuries, Egypt had been under Persian occupation, controlling the fertile Egyptian land, producing an abundance of grain as compared to other parts of the classical world, and using it to feed the enormous Persian Empire. The Persian Empire stretched all the way across Mesopotamia, deep into modern-day Asia, across Anatolia, as well as the entirety of ancient Egypt. On the Persian Empire's northwestern edge lie a small kingdom that quickly excelled to imperial status in Greece beginning in 359 BC, called Macedonia. Under the rule of King Philip II, Macedonia would, at an unprecedented rate, conquer and unite the majority of Greek city-states under a single monarchy. By 336 BC, Philip had devised plans to launch an assault into Asia Minor to free the Greeks living along the western coast under Persian control. But on October 21st of 336 BC, Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. Before the assassin could successfully flee, he was apprehended and stabbed to death, meaning that to this day, no one has ever known the full extent or cause of Philip's assassination. But the result was very clear. His son Alexander would be heir to the throne. In the wake of his father's death, Alexander blamed Darius, the Persian king, for the conspiracy that took his father's life, and Alexander set out on a campaign to not only free the Greeks living under Persian control like his father had intended, but to kill Darius and conquer and absorb the Persian Empire into Macedonia. Originally, as far as we know, Egypt was not a primary location Alexander intended to conquer and take from Persia. But in time, he realized that if they were to fight a lengthy campaign in the Middle East, then his western edge needed to be protected and would need a source of food for his army. Egypt was that western edge, and due to its fertile soil, it was known as the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. It was the most strategic location for Alexander to take from Persia before campaigning deeper into the Middle East. He arrived in a small city given the Greek name Pelusium, formerly known to the Egyptians as either Senna or Per Amun. He received no resistance and was welcomed as a liberator in Egypt, as the Persian leadership had already fled from the region. According to Plutarch's account of Alexander's life, there were two things that Alexander always traveled with: his Macedonian sword, the kopis, symbolizing his authority as a military leader, and Homer's Iliad. If you haven't heard of this before, in 750 BC, the Greek author Homer wrote one of the most famous pieces of literature in world history, the Iliad and the Odyssey, detailing the events leading up to, during, and following the siege of Troy, which presumably took place about 500 years earlier in around 1200 BC, nearly 1,000 years before the time of Alexander. In Book 4 of the Odyssey, Homer mentions a small island or harbor called Pharos off the coast of Egypt. However, in 750 BC, Greek knowledge of Egypt was quite limited, perhaps even less than the Bronze Age, so the official knowledge of this semi-mythical ancient Egyptian harbor had long faded from Greek memory by Alexander's time, and it is easy to imagine that when Alexander set out to conquer Egypt, he surely intended to attempt to rediscover this harbor mentioned in his favorite book. And so, after reaching Memphis, he set out to find Pharos, complete with a posse of childhood friends, including Ptolemy, a man who will become a very important character later in the series. The romantic sources tell us that when Alexander arrived at the unassuming island, he saw a great open space stretching out into the infinite distance that was occupied by 12 small villages. But in all reality, while it was love at first sight for Alexander, the long anticipated arrival for the army was probably somewhat anticlimactic. Only a few lowly fishermen and the remnants of some pirate homes were settled there. In Alexander's eyes, he saw the immense potential of the geographical location of Pharos and the nearby coast. If he could somehow connect Pharos with the coastline, he could create one of the most strategically located harbors ever built. Not only that, but the area was fed fresh water from the Nile River into the Lake Mareotis to the south, while still being far enough away from the rivers to avoid seasonal devastation of flooding. This harbor could provide Alexander readily access to the Mediterranean, the Nile, the Red Sea, and even the Indian Ocean. Immediately, he ordered the construction of a 1,300-meter long causeway to connect Pharos with the coastline where he now intended to build his dream city. Unable to contain his excitement, he had to begin drawing out plans for the new city. He looked around for a piece of chalk from one of his men, but when none was available, he grabbed a handful of grain from a supply wagon, dropped to his knees, and began plotting the layout of the city that would be built in his name right next to the harbor mentioned in his favorite childhood book. His new city would sit right between the lake and the ocean, just beneath Pharos Island. The streets would be angled to allow the ocean breeze to rush through them, cooling the residents under the Egyptian sun. The main streets would be nearly 100 feet wide to allow the passage of multiple lanes of horses and chariots. There would be a market square, and temples would dot the city to serve both Greek and Egyptian gods. And there would be a great library to gather all of the world's knowledge. All of this was mapped out in grain by Alexander's own hand. Plutarch tells us that when he finished plotting the city, a flock of seabirds came and devoured the grain right in front of him. Shocked by what seemed like an ominous omen, those around him saw it as a sign that Alexander's new city would feed many nations. And so, early in the year of 331 BC, the foundations of the city were laid, and it would be named in honor of its founder, Alexandria. I'm Luke Caverns. I'm so excited to get started on this new series. If this is something you'd be interested in, well then, if you'd like to keep up with the series, please like and subscribe for more. As always, thank you so much to all of my patrons and YouTube members who make everything that I do possible. For more videos on ancient civilizations, please like and subscribe for more.